Amazon voiced concerns about Anthropic AI models before U.S. government's crackdown, source says. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. They raised concerns about Anthropic's AI models directly with U.S. government officials. Not in a press release. Not in public. Behind closed doors, to regulators who were already watching. This matters because it tells you something fundamental about the AI market right now. Amazon isn't just a customer. Amazon is also a competitor. And when a player that size starts flagging another player's technology to the government, it signals something has shifted in the competitive calculus. Let me break down what actually happened here. Amazon Web Services hosts Anthropic's infrastructure. They have deep visibility into what Claude can do, how fast it's improving, and what capabilities are emerging. But Amazon also has $35 billion in annual revenue from cloud services alone. And Anthropic's Claude models are becoming a serious alternative to the tools Amazon wants to sell. So the question becomes, why now? Why would Amazon go to regulators instead of just competing harder? The answer is strategic. When a company goes to the government with concerns, it's usually because they believe market competition alone won't produce the outcome they want. This suggests Amazon believes Anthropic's trajectory, or specific capabilities in their models, represents a risk that requires regulatory intervention. Not just market risk. Regulatory risk. Here's the second layer that matters: timing. This conversation happened before the U.S. government's recent crackdown on AI model exports and advanced computing chip access to certain countries. The crackdown itself targets China and other strategic adversaries. But the fact that Amazon was already raising flags with regulators suggests there was appetite in government circles to listen. Companies don't typically waste time talking to regulators unless they sense the audience is receptive. What does this mean for India? India is now a critical hub for AI development and cloud infrastructure. Indian engineers train models, fine-tune systems, and deploy infrastructure for every major AI lab in the world. If regulatory pressure increases on advanced AI model capabilities, Indian teams embedded in U.S. companies will feel it first. Hiring freezes. Export restrictions on certain datasets. Tighter vetting of who can access cutting-edge model weights. This isn't speculative, this is how regulatory cascades work. They start at the top, then filter down to the teams and countries doing the work. The other implication: this is a signaling moment for competitive dynamics in AI. When companies start going to regulators, it means they believe the technology itself, not just deployment or usage, is where the leverage lies. Claude's improved reasoning, longer context windows, and lower latency have made it genuinely competitive against GPT-4. If Amazon sees that as a regulatory problem, it's because they see it as a market problem they can't solve alone. That shapes how every other AI company, every other investor, every other regulator, thinks about what comes next. So what changes now? Watch for three things. First, watch whether other major cloud providers or AI companies follow Amazon's lead and also raise concerns with regulators. If this was isolated, it's a competitive move. If it's a pattern, it's the beginning of a regulatory cascade. Second, watch India's government response. Will they push back on U.S. regulations that constrain Indian engineers and companies? Or will they align with Western regulatory frameworks? That answer shapes whether India stays a hub for AI development or becomes constrained by policy. Third, watch Anthropic's next funding round and partnerships. If regulatory pressure increases, their ability to partner with certain companies or access certain markets will narrow. That's when you'll know if this signal was real. The last thing worth noting: Amazon's move is actually quite smart from a business perspective. They're not attacking Anthropic directly. They're not cutting off their partnership. They're simply raising legitimate questions with regulators about capabilities that might need oversight. It's competitive strategy wrapped in the language of responsibility. Every other player in AI is now taking notes on whether this works. If it does, expect to see more companies use regulatory channels as a competitive lever. If it doesn't, expect companies to go back to pure market competition. This is a pivotal moment where business strategy, regulatory policy, and technological capability are colliding. Keep watching Anthropic's next moves, Amazon's cloud strategy, and how Indian AI teams navigate the regulatory uncertainty ahead. The next 30 days will tell you whether this becomes a template for how AI competition gets decided. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.